I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor with a sound like breaking crystal dreams, and with it, the elegant facade of New Year's Eve at the Crystal Chalet crumbled into something far more sinister. Moments before, the exclusive Alpine retreat had sparkled with the refined gaiety of Europe's social elite. The chalet itself was a masterpiece of modern architecture, its glass walls reflecting the snow-laden peaks of the Swiss mountains, while offering its privileged guests both luxury and isolation. On this final night of the year, the Grand Salon hummed with sophisticated conversation, the gentle clink of crystal and the soft strains of a string quartet positioned discreetly in the gallery above. Now, as the grandfather clock chimed midnight and confetti settled like snow upon the Persian carpets, Dr. Alistair Finch lay motionless beside the towering crystal display case that housed the chalet's most prized possession, a collection of rare gems worth more than most men would see in a lifetime. The renowned gemologist, who had been selected by their hostess, Baroness Helena von Stauffen, to lead the traditional midnight toast, would never again appraise another precious stone. His body was twisted at an unnatural angle, his evening clothes disheveled, and his face bore the unmistakable pallor of death. The champagne flute that had slipped from his fingers lay in glittering fragments around him, its contents mixing with something far more precious and far more permanent. "Mon Dieu," whispered Madame Celeste Dubois, the French art dealer whose usually impeccable composure had cracked like fine porcelain. Her gloved hand pressed against her throat as she stared at the scene before them. The Baroness, a woman whose steel-gray hair and imperious bearing commanded respect in the salons of Vienna and Paris, stepped forward with the measured pace of one accustomed to taking charge in crisis. "Dr. Brenner," she called to the elderly Swiss physician who had been among the evening's guests, "if you would be so kind." Dr. Heinrich Brenner, whose weathered hands had tended to ailments both common and curious throughout his long career in the mountain villages, approached the fallen man with professional gravity. His examination was brief but thorough, his expression growing increasingly grave as he worked. "I'm afraid Dr. Finch is beyond any assistance I might provide," he announced, rising slowly from his kneeling position. "However, I must observe that the circumstances of his death are peculiar." A collective intake of breath swept through the assembled guests. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the celebrated actress whose dramatic instincts served her well even in genuine crisis, pressed her jeweled fingers to her lips. "Peculiar? In what manner, Doctor?" Dr. Brenner's eyes, sharp despite his advanced years, surveyed the room with clinical precision. "There is a distinct odor of bitter almonds about the deceased, combined with the rapidity of his collapse and the absence of any obvious trauma." He paused, allowing the implication to settle like morning frost. "I fear we may be dealing with a case of poisoning." The word hung in the air like an accusation, transforming each face in the room from that of a fellow mourner to a potential suspect. The Crystal Chalet, which had seemed a glittering sanctuary above the world, suddenly felt more like a prison of glass and snow. "Poisoning." The voice belonged to Mr. Julian Thorne, the ambitious young financier whose nervous habit of consulting his pocket watch had become more pronounced as the evening progressed. "But that's impossible. We all drank from the same bottles, ate the same food." "Not necessarily," observed Miss Eleanor Vance, the sharp-tongued novelist whose keen intellect was as renowned as her literary works. Dr. Finch had been examining the Baroness's collection privately this afternoon. He dined separately in the library, claiming he needed quiet to complete his assessment. All eyes turned to the Baroness, whose expression remained as unreadable as carved marble. "It is true," she confirmed with characteristic directness. "Alistair preferred to work undisturbed when handling pieces of such value. I had a light supper sent to him in the library at his request." Then the poison could have been administered at any point during the evening. concluded Captain Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, the retired military man whose experience with death in various forms lent weight to his observations. The question becomes, who had both opportunity and motive? The storm outside chose that moment to intensify, rattling the great windows and reminding everyone of their isolation. The narrow mountain road that provided the chalet's only access would be impassable until the weather cleared, a circumstance that could trap them for days. Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, the Baroness's efficient secretary and companion, stepped forward with characteristic practicality. "I shall telephone the authorities immediately," she announced, moving toward the ornate telephone in the entrance hall. "I fear you will find the lines down," called Emile Keller, the chalet's caretaker, from his position near the great windows. His scarred face, marked by years of mountain weather, bore a grim expression. "The storm has brought down the wires. We are quite cut off until it passes." The implications of their situation settled over the group like a shroud. Trapped in an isolated chalet with a murderer among them, surrounded by the pristine beauty of the Alps that had become their prison, they faced a long night and possibly longer days before help could arrive. But unknown to the assembled guests, help was already on its way. Earlier that evening, before the storm had severed all communication, a telegram had been dispatched from the village below. It bore urgent news that would bring to the Crystal Chalet a small, meticulous Belgian gentleman whose reputation for solving the most perplexing mysteries was known throughout Europe. Hercule Poirot, delayed by the weather but determined to reach his destination, was even now making his careful way up the treacherous mountain road, his little grey cells already beginning to work on the puzzle that awaited him. For now, however, the guests of the Crystal Chalet could only stare at the still form of Dr. Alistair Finch and wonder which among them had chosen to begin the new year with murder. The Crystal Palace had become a house of secrets, and before the truth emerged, more than champagne would be spilled upon its pristine floors. The oppressive silence that had settled over the Crystal Chalet's grand salon was broken by 3 sharp raps upon the main entrance door. The sound cut through the storm's howling with such precision that it seemed almost orchestrated, causing every head to turn toward the foyer with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Emile Keller moved swiftly to answer, his weathered hands working the heavy bolts with practiced efficiency. As the door swung open, a swirl of snow and bitter wind invaded the warm sanctuary, carrying with it a small, immaculately dressed figure who stepped across the threshold with the careful precision of a man who regarded disorder as a personal affront. Hercule Poirot paused just inside the doorway, his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the treacherous journey. He lifted the hems of his perfectly pressed trousers between forefinger and thumb, examining the wet prints he had made upon the polished parquet with an expression of delicate disapproval. "Pardon," he murmured, his accented English carrying the musical cadence that had become his trademark. One would not wish to create a pattern so irregular upon a floor so beautiful. The Baroness stepped forward, relief evident in her aristocratic bearing despite her attempt to maintain composure. "Monsieur Poirot, I feared the storm had made passage impossible." "The elements, they did their utmost to discourage me," Poirot replied, removing his overcoat with methodical care. "But your telegram spoke of urgent matters concerning your collection, though I perceive now that something far more precious than gems has been lost this evening." His bright green eyes swept the room, taking in the covered form near the crystal display case, the shattered champagne flute, and most importantly, the faces of those assembled. Dr. Brenner approached with professional gravity. "Dr. Alistair Finch, the gemologist you were expecting to meet. Poisoned, I believe. The symptoms suggest cyanide." Poirot inclined his head, moving toward the scene with the measured steps of a dancer. He did not kneel beside the body, but bent with the precise angle of a jeweler, examining a particularly complex setting, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly. "Oui, the bitter almonds. Faint now, nearly lost among the perfumes and champagne, but unmistakable to one who has encountered such tragedies before." He collapsed at the stroke of midnight, offered Miss Eleanor Vance, her novelist's instincts compelling her to provide details. During the New Year's toast, we had all gathered around the display case. All? Poirot's eyebrows rose in two perfectly symmetrical arcs. And the champagne, how was it distributed? Lady Beatrice shifted uncomfortably, her theatrical poise wavering. There were 2 trays of glasses. I may have handed one to Dr. Finch, though he seemed distracted. And then Madame Dubois, she traded with him, added Julian Thorne, consulting his pocket watch nervously. Something about preferring a finer stem. Madame Dubois's gloved hands tightened. A mere courtesy. One hopes for elegance, even in such circumstances. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his gaze shifting to the shattered cristal. Most interesting. And yet I observe something curious. He gestured toward the fragments. The glass. It fell from his right hand. Non. But observe the way he holds his evening program. He indicated a small card that had fallen beside the body. Dr. Finch, he was left-handed. A man does not suddenly change such fundamental habits, even in death. The observation sent a ripple of unease through the assembled guests. Captain Hartwell cleared his throat. What are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot? I suggest nothing yet, mon ami. I merely observe. The little grey cells, they require facts before they can arrange themselves into truth. Poirot straightened, his attention turning to the Baroness. You mentioned that Dr. Finch dined separately this evening. In the library, at his own request. He wished to complete his assessment undisturbed. And who had access to this private meal? Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward efficiently. I arranged for the tray to be prepared. Greta, our housemaid, delivered it at 7 o'clock. This Greta, she remains in the house. In the kitchen quarters, yes, though she's quite distraught. Poirot nodded, his eyes making one final sweep of the crime scene. Then we shall speak with her presently. But first, I must insist that nothing further be disturbed. This room, it tells a story, and we must not allow careless hands to edit its pages. He turned to address the group with quiet authority. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your desire to retire, but I fear we must all remain available. A murderer walks among us, and until that person is identified, none of us can claim safety. The storm continued its assault upon the crystal walls, but within the chalet, a different kind of tempest was beginning to stir as Hercule Poirot prepared to unravel the deadly web that had claimed Dr. Finch's life. Poirot gestured toward the library with the precise economy of movement that characterized all his actions. We shall examine the scene where Dr. Finch spent his final hours and speak with those who attended him. Madame la Baroness, if you would accompany me, along with Madame Pemberton and the housemaid, Greta. The library welcomed them with the scent of leather bindings and the lingering aroma of coffee. A fire had burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the Persian carpet. On a small table near the window sat the remnants of Dr. Finch's final meal. An empty soup bowl, a plate bearing only crumbs, and a coffee cup positioned with mathematical precision upon its saucer. Poirot approached the table with the reverence of a pilgrim visiting a shrine. The meal, it was consumed entirely. Dr. Finch had an excellent appetite, Mrs. Pemberton replied, her efficient manner intact despite the circumstances. He specifically requested the consommé and asked that it be kept simple. And you, ma petite? Poirot addressed the nervous housemaid who hovered near the doorway. You served him personally. Greta curtsied awkwardly. Yes, monsieur, at 7 o'clock precisely, as Madame Pemberton instructed. Dr. Finch was already at work examining the beautiful stones with his special glass. He seemed well, in good spirits. Oh, yes, sir. He thanked me most kindly and said he would ring if he required anything further. Her voice trembled slightly. He was such a gentleman, sir. Who would want to harm him? Poirot's keen eyes swept the room, noting the leather portfolio open beside the armchair, its contents neatly arranged. And after the meal was served, who else entered this room? Mrs. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. I brought some correspondence at 9:30. Dr. Finch did not answer my knock, so I slipped the envelope beneath the door. The envelope contained what, precisely? Insurance documentation regarding the collection. Routine paperwork that required his signature. Poirot knelt beside the door, his fingertips tracing the gap beneath. Yet I observe no envelope here now. Most curious. He straightened, his gaze falling upon the coffee service. This cup, it has been used twice, non? Observe the faint ring upon the saucer, and yet the cup sits precisely centered. A man does not naturally replace his cup with such exactitude after drinking. Greta's eyes widened. Oh, sir, I did bring fresh coffee at 10 o'clock. Dr. Finch said the first had grown cold and he wished to work late into the evening. Ah, a second service. And who prepared this later coffee? I did, sir, in the kitchen. Dr. Finch was most particular about the temperature. You were alone in the kitchen at this time? The girl hesitated. Well, Monsieur Keller came through briefly, checking the heating pipes, and I believe one of the ladies passed through to the pantry, though I was focused on my task. Which lady, if you please? I cannot be certain, sir. I only glimpsed a dark dress and heard heels upon the stone floor. Poirot moved to the French doors leading to the terrace, testing the handle. These doors, they remain locked? Always, sir, Keller interjected. The mountain weather makes them treacherous in winter. And yet, Poirot examined the lock mechanism closely. The mechanism shows signs of recent use. Oil from fingers, very fresh. He turned to face the group, his expression thoughtful. Dr. Finch received visitors this evening, though not all announced themselves properly. Mrs. Pemberton's composure cracked slightly. I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, my visit was entirely proper. If Dr. Finch had already... if the poison had already been administered. Ah, but you assume the poison came with the evening coffee. Yet consider this. A man who dies at midnight from cyanide poisoning must have ingested the substance mere minutes before his collapse. The symptoms, they do not permit a delay of hours. The implications of this observation settled over the group like a shroud. If Dr. Finch had been poisoned just before midnight, then the killer had been among the guests gathered for the New Year's toast. We return now to the salon, Poirot announced. I shall speak with each guest individually. Someone among your party harbors a deadly secret, and before this night ends, the truth shall be revealed. As they filed back toward the Grand Salon, Poirot lingered for a moment in the library doorway, his little grey cells already beginning to arrange the pieces of this deadly puzzle. Returning to the Grand Salon, Poirot positioned himself near the fireplace, his keen eyes surveying the assembled guests with the patience of a master craftsman examining precious stones for flaws. The storm continued its relentless assault upon the crystal walls, but within the elegant room a different kind of tempest was brewing as each person awaited their turn under his scrutiny. Before we proceed with individual conversations, Poirot announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had solved countless mysteries. I require absolute clarity regarding the final moments of Dr. Finch's life. The champagne service, if you please, describe it once more with precision. Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her theatrical training evident in her composed recounting. 2 silver trays, each bearing 6 crystal flutes. I assisted with the distribution, selecting glasses from the tray nearest the display case. Dr. Finch received his initial glass from my hand. But there was an exchange, Madame Dubois interjected, her French accent more pronounced under stress. I requested a different glass, one with a more delicate stem. We exchanged flutes perhaps 2 minutes before midnight. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. So Dr. Finch held 2 different glasses during the evening's conclusion. And during these final moments, did anyone observe him consume anything other than champagne? An uncomfortable silence settled over the group before Miss Eleanor Vance spoke hesitantly. He did seem to be sucking on something during the final hour. I assumed it was a throat lozenge. The mountain air can be quite harsh. A throat lozenge, Poirot repeated, his eyebrows rising with interest. "And from where might such a remedy be obtained?" Mrs. Pemberton cleared her throat efficiently. "I maintain a small supply in the powder room for guests. Imported from London, very soothing. Several guests mentioned the dry air this evening." "Fascinating. Now then, I shall speak with each of you individually. Madame Dubois, if you would accompany me to the morning room." In the smaller, more intimate space, Madame Dubois settled gracefully into a velvet chair, though Poirot noticed the slight tremor in her gloved hands. "You knew Dr. Finch professionally for many years, no?" "Indeed. We met frequently at auctions in Geneva and Paris. He was fastidious, sometimes difficult, but his reputation was unassailable." She paused, then added quietly, "Until recently." "Ah, there were concerns about his judgment." Her composure wavered slightly. "Whispers in the trade, nothing substantiated, but some questioned whether his assessments had become overly generous to certain clients." "And tonight, did he confide his impressions of the Baroness's collection?" "He seemed troubled by something. When I complimented his expertise during dinner, he merely nodded and returned to examining the Star of Kandahar with unusual intensity." Poirot thanked her and summoned Julian Thorne, whose nervous energy was immediately apparent as he consulted his pocket watch upon entering. "Your business interests are connected to tonight's valuation, are they not?" Thorne's face flushed. "My firm arranged financing for the museum exhibition based on preliminary estimates. If Dr. Finch had significantly reduced the collection's value—" He swallowed hard. "It would have been financially catastrophic." "And at midnight you observed Dr. Finch closely?" "He was directly to my left, perhaps 3 feet away. I remember because he seemed to sway slightly before raising his glass. Then he took that sip and, Thorne shuddered. "You mentioned he bumped your sleeve. With which hand did he hold his glass?" "His right hand, I believe, though the moment was so brief, so shocking." Lady Beatrice entered next with theatrical flair, though her eyes betrayed genuine distress. "Monsieur Poirot, this waiting is unbearable. What do you wish to know?" "During the evening you visited the service corridor. For what purpose?" She hesitated, her fingers toying with the pearls at her throat. "I sought the powder room, and yes, I may have taken one of those throat lozenges. The air was quite dry." "You took one, or you observed others doing so?" "Both, I believe." "Several guests mentioned the discomfort." Her voice grew quieter. "Dr. Finch specifically asked if I knew where he might find such relief." "And you directed him to the powder room?" "I offered to fetch one for him, but he declined, saying he preferred to select his own remedies." As Lady Beatrice departed, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his little grey cells beginning to arrange the emerging pattern. The throat lozenge represented a crucial piece of the puzzle, but questions remained about timing, opportunity, and the deadly transformation of a simple remedy into an instrument of murder. The truth was beginning to crystallize, like ice forming on the chalet's windows, but several crucial elements still required his methodical attention before the complete picture would emerge. Captain Sir Geoffrey Hartwell entered the morning room with military precision, his bearing suggesting a man accustomed to facing difficult situations with stoic resolve. Poirot observed the slight limp that favored his left leg, a souvenir from his service years that became more pronounced under stress. "Captain, your military experience makes you an astute observer of human behavior. What did you notice about Dr. Finch during the evening's final hour?" Hartwell settled into his chair with careful deliberation. "The man was agitated, I'll give you that. Kept checking his pocket watch against the grandfather clock, as if timing were crucial to his purpose, most unlike his usual methodical nature." He paused, his weathered features creasing with concentration. "I stood behind him during the champagne service, near the string quartet's alcove, but there was something else that struck me as significant." "Oui?" "Just before midnight, perhaps 5 minutes before the toast, I observed him accept something from another guest." Not the champagne glass, mind you, but something small passed from hand to hand during the general movement as we gathered around the display case. Poirot's eyebrows rose with keen interest. You observed who made this transfer? The lighting was dim, and people were shifting positions constantly. I saw the gesture, but couldn't identify the person clearly. A dark sleeve, that's all I can say with certainty. But it was deliberate, purposeful, not a casual exchange. As Hartwell departed, Miss Eleanor Vance entered with the confident stride of a woman accustomed to unraveling mysteries through her fiction. Her sharp eyes immediately assessed Poirot with the same intensity she might apply to a particularly complex plot point. Monsieur Poirot, I suspect you've already deduced more than you're revealing. In my novels, the detective always knows the solution by this point. Ah, but life, it is more complex than fiction, mademoiselle. Reality requires proof, not merely clever deduction. Poirot studied her intently. You spent considerable time observing Dr. Finch this evening. What prompted such attention? Professional curiosity, nothing more. I'm researching a novel involving art authentication, and his methods fascinated me. Her composure flickered momentarily. The way he examined each piece with such intensity, making notes in that leather portfolio of his handwriting became increasingly agitated as the evening progressed. And the final moments before his collapse? Miss Vance leaned forward, her novelist's instincts fully engaged. At precisely 5 minutes to midnight, as the quartet began their final selection, I saw him place something in his mouth. He had been coughing intermittently throughout the evening, complaining of the dry mountain air. You observed from where he obtained this remedy. That's what made it memorable. He didn't fetch it himself from the powder room as others had done. Someone approached him discreetly and pressed something into his palm. He examined it briefly, then consumed it immediately. She hesitated. There was something wrapped around it, a tissue or small paper, which he folded with unusual care before tucking it away. Most observant, mademoiselle. And after consuming this item? He seemed relieved initially, but within moments began to show signs of distress. The timing was quite precise, actually. When Miss Vance departed, Poirot summoned Mrs. Pemberton, whose efficient manner remained intact despite the late hour and shocking circumstances. However, he noticed a slight tremor in her usually steady hands. Your role as companion requires intimate knowledge of the household's routines, Poirot began gently. Tell me about your interaction with Dr. Finch during the evening's final hour. Mrs. Pemberton's composure wavered slightly. Dr. Finch approached me around 11 o'clock, quite agitated about his throat irritation. He had visited the powder room several times, but found the communal lozenges insufficient for his needs. And you offered assistance? I maintain a personal supply of superior throat remedies in my handbag, imported directly from London. When he became quite insistent, almost demanding, I provided him with one of my private lozenges, wrapped in tissue to maintain its freshness. This conversation, it was observed by others? Possibly. We spoke in the corridor near the powder room. Dr. Finch was rather emphatic about his discomfort, and I wished to help. Her voice grew quieter. I wrapped it carefully and instructed him to wait until just before midnight, as these particular lozenges are quite potent and work best on an empty stomach. You recommended the precise timing. I did. I told him 5 minutes before midnight would be optimal, allowing the remedy to take effect just as the evening concluded. As Mrs. Pemberton left, Poirot returned to the Grand Salon, his mind working with increasing intensity. Moving purposefully to the crystal display case, he knelt and examined the lower rim with the precision of a jeweler studying a precious stone. His fingertips detected something that had escaped earlier notice. Ah, he murmured, carefully extracting a small, neatly folded piece of tissue paper that had been tucked beneath the case's ornate base. The folding was precise, almost military in its economy, each crease sharp and deliberate. Straightening, he addressed the assembled guests. Ladies and gentlemen, we have made significant progress. The method of Dr. Finch's poisoning is now clear, and the timeline established with precision. However, I must caution you that appearances can be most deceiving, and the obvious solution is not always the correct one. His gaze swept the room, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the barely perceptible changes in breathing patterns. Tomorrow, when the storm has passed and our isolation ends, we shall gather once more for the final revelation. Until then, I suggest we all retire, though I fear sleep will come uneasily to some among us tonight. The wind continued its assault upon the crystal walls, but within the chalet, a different kind of storm was brewing as Poirot's little grey cells worked through the night, arranging the pieces of this deadly puzzle into their final, shocking configuration. Dawn broke over the crystal chalet with deceptive serenity, the storm having exhausted itself during the night hours. The pristine snow that had transformed the mountain landscape into a glittering prison now sparkled with innocent beauty, belying the dark secrets contained within the glass walls. Breakfast in the elegant dining room was a subdued affair, the customary clatter of silverware and polite conversation replaced by hushed whispers and the occasional nervous cough. Each guest seemed acutely aware of the empty chair that should have held Dr. Finch, a grim reminder of mortality and the chilling presence of a murderer among them. Poirot, impeccable in his morning attire despite the circumstances, observed the scene with his characteristic attention to detail. He ate sparingly, his eyes moving from face to face, registering every nuance of expression, every suppressed gesture. The detective was not merely searching for obvious signs of guilt, but for the subtle betrayals of the inner self that no amount of social training could entirely conceal. "A pity, is it not?" Poirot began, his accented voice carrying clearly in the hushed room, "that such a beautiful morning should follow such a tragic night. The calm after the storm, one might say, though perhaps it is merely the calm before another tempest entirely." He paused deliberately, allowing his gaze to linger on each guest in turn, noting how Julian Thorne's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, how Mrs. Pemberton's usual efficiency seemed forced and brittle. "The human mind," Poirot continued, stirring his coffee with mathematical precision, "it is a most fascinating landscape, so many hidden pathways, so many secret gardens where motives bloom unseen. And guilt is perhaps the most persistent of gardeners, constantly tending to its thorny roses." His eyes settled momentarily on Mrs. Pemberton, who suddenly found the pattern of her tablecloth intensely absorbing. During the night hours, while the household slept uneasily, Poirot had conducted his own methodical investigation. The powder room had yielded interesting discoveries: 2 containers of throat remedies, one communal and well-used, the other bearing Mrs. Pemberton's preferred London brand. The arrangement of the lozenges told a story to those who knew how to read such details. Some wrappers were crumpled carelessly, others folded with precise, almost military economy. One compartment in the superior tin showed a telling vacancy where an oval lozenge should have rested. "Order, you see, is everything," Poirot observed, examining a sugar cube with the intensity others might reserve for precious gems. "Even in chaos, there exists a pattern. Those who seek to impose a false pattern often betray themselves through their own innate sense of organization, or perhaps their lack thereof when applied to deception." Captain Hartwell cleared his throat with what seemed deliberate loudness. "Surely, Monsieur Poirot, you don't suggest that attention to detail indicates guilt." "Au contraire, mon ami. I suggest that habits, they are like fingerprints of the soul. A person who folds handkerchiefs in precise squares will fold tissue paper the same way, even when wrapping something intended for a deadly purpose." Poirot's observation sent a subtle ripple of unease through the assembled guests. Madame Dubois, who had maintained an unnervingly still composure throughout breakfast, finally spoke. "As one who deals in authenticity versus forgery, monsieur, I understand that even the most skilled deceiver leaves traces of their true nature. Precisely, madame. The throat lozenge, for instance. Such a simple remedy, yet how it was delivered, when it was consumed, and by whose hand it was transferred, these details become threads in a tapestry of truth. And some threads, when pulled with sufficient care, unravel the entire design. Miss Vance leaned forward slightly, her novelist's instincts engaged. You speak as though you already know the identity of Dr. Finch's killer. Poirot rose from the table, his breakfast concluded with characteristic precision. I know many things, mademoiselle. I know that our murderer planned this crime with considerable care, yet made several crucial errors born of overconfidence. I know that the method was ingenious but not perfect, and I know that before this day concludes, the truth will emerge as surely as the sun has risen over these mountains. The morning light streaming through the crystal walls seemed to grow more intense, casting sharp shadows that divided the room into areas of brilliance and darkness. Within the chalet, the psychological pressure was building like steam in a kettle, and Poirot's little grey cells continued their relentless work, arranging the final pieces of this deadly puzzle into their shocking, inevitable conclusion. The morning light streaming through the crystal chalet's magnificent windows cast everything in sharp relief, including the subtle tensions that played across each guest's features as they lingered over breakfast. Poirot observed them with the patience of a master craftsman, noting how Julian Thorne's nervous habit of checking his pocket watch had intensified, how Mrs. Pemberton's usual efficiency seemed brittle and forced, and how Captain Hartwell's military bearing appeared more pronounced under stress. The human mind, Poirot began, his accented voice carrying clearly in the hushed dining room, it seeks order, even in chaos. This is both a blessing and a curse for those who would deceive, for habits of organization betray us even when we believe ourselves most clever. He produced the small, neatly folded piece of tissue paper from his waistcoat pocket, holding it up to catch the morning light. This simple scrap tells a story of precision, of a mind that cannot help but impose order even in the most clandestine circumstances. The effect was immediate and telling. Mrs. Pemberton's coffee cup rattled slightly against its saucer, while Captain Hartwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Miss Vance leaned forward with the keen interest of a novelist recognizing a crucial plot point, and Madame Dubois' usually steady hands betrayed the slightest tremor. You see, Poirot continued, unfolding and refolding the tissue with delicate care. Each crease is sharp, deliberate, not the hurried, crumpled effort of someone disposing of a wrapper without thought. This speaks of a mind that values precision above all else, even in moments of deadly purpose. After breakfast, Poirot requested private audiences with each guest, beginning with Mrs. Pemberton in the morning room. Her usually impeccable composure showed hairline cracks as she settled into the velvet chair, her efficient manner intact but somehow forced. The throat lozenges you provided to Dr. Finch, Poirot began gently. They were from your personal supply, wrapped with care to preserve their potency. Yes, as I explained. Dr. Finch was most insistent about his discomfort, and I wished to help. Her voice carried its usual crisp authority, but her hands remained clasped tightly in her lap. And you recommended the precise timing for consumption. The lozenges are quite potent. I advised him to wait until just before midnight for optimal effect. She paused, then added with what seemed forced casualness, though I must say his manner was rather demanding. Not at all his usual courteous self. Demanding in what way, precisely? Mrs. Pemberton's composure flickered. He seemed agitated about something beyond mere throat irritation. He mentioned needing to settle matters before the evening concluded, though he wouldn't elaborate. When Mrs. Pemberton departed, Poirot made his way to the library where Dr. Finch had spent his final hours. In the clear morning light, details emerged that Shadow had previously concealed. The leather portfolio lay open on the desk, its contents arranged with characteristic precision, yet something about the arrangement troubled Poirot's methodical mind. "Most curious," he murmured, examining the papers more closely. Dr. Finch's notes showed his usual meticulous approach in the early pages, but the final entries revealed increasing agitation. The handwriting grew erratic, words were crossed out with violent strokes, and in the margins, repeated question marks appeared beside monetary valuations. More significantly, Poirot noticed that several pages appeared to be missing from the portfolio's final section. The leather binding showed indentations where papers had been removed, and the sequential numbering in Dr. Finch's careful script showed clear gaps. Returning to the Grand Salon, Poirot found Captain Hartwell standing by the crystal display case, his weathered features reflecting the morning light. The military man's posture straightened as Poirot approached, a gesture so automatic it seemed unconscious. "Captain, your observation skills served you well last evening. You mentioned seeing Dr. Finch secure something in his pocket with his left hand, then raise his glass with his right." "Correct. It struck me as significant because he had been using his left hand predominantly throughout the evening. A man doesn't suddenly alter such fundamental habits without reason." "Indeed not. And this transfer of the glass, it occurred immediately after he consumed the throat lozenge." Hartwell nodded grimly. Within moments, he seemed to realize something was terribly wrong, but by then, he gestured helplessly toward the spot where Dr. Finch had collapsed. "You have military experience with various forms of unfortunate demise. What was your assessment of the timing?" "Cyanide acts swiftly once absorbed. If he consumed the poison at 5 minutes to midnight, his collapse at the stroke of 12 fits the expected timeline perfectly." As the morning progressed, Poirot conducted similar interviews with each guest, noting not only their words, but their unconscious gestures, the way they folded napkins when offered refreshment, how they arranged papers when consulting notes. Each person revealed their natural habits of organization, and gradually, a pattern began to emerge. The throat lozenge had been the delivery method, but the true complexity lay in the timing, the opportunity, and most crucially, the missing pages from Dr. Finch's portfolio. Someone had not only silenced the gemologist, but had also sought to suppress his final findings, suggesting a desperation that went beyond simple murder to encompass the concealment of potentially devastating discoveries. By midday, as the mountain sun cast sharp shadows through the crystal walls, Poirot's little gray cells had arranged the evidence into an increasingly clear pattern. The methodical killer had made several crucial errors, each born of the very precision that had enabled the crime. The truth was crystallizing like ice forming on the chalet's windows, and soon, very soon, the final revelation would shatter the elegant facade that concealed a murderer's desperate gamble. The Crystal Chalet held its secrets close, but Hercule Poirot had built his reputation on coaxing truth from the most reluctant sources. Before another day passed, justice would be served as precisely as the crime itself had been executed. The afternoon light streaming through the Crystal Chalet's magnificent windows seemed to sharpen every detail as Poirot continued his methodical investigation. Having spent the morning hours in careful observation and preliminary interviews, the Belgian detective now turned his attention to those who served in the shadows, understanding that truth often resided in the spaces between the obvious. Emile Keller awaited him in the modest sitting room adjacent to the kitchen, his weathered features bearing the stoic expression of a man accustomed to mountain storms, both literal and metaphorical. The caretaker's scarred hands rested quietly on his knees, but Poirot noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes avoided direct contact with the same careful precision others might use to avoid looking directly into bright light. "You have maintained this chalet for many years, Monsieur Keller. Your observations of the guests would be most valuable to my investigation." Keller nodded slowly, his English carrying the careful precision of one who had learned the language through necessity rather than education. 15 years I've worked for the Baroness. I know the sounds of the house, the rhythms of those who visit. Dr. Finch, he was different from his usual visits. Not just agitated, but determined You understand? He asked many questions about the security arrangements, about who had access to the collection during his assessment. Poirot's eyebrows rose with keen interest. He expressed specific concerns about security breaches? More than concerns, monsieur. He seemed to suspect that someone had examined the pieces without his knowledge. He found fingerprints on cases that should have remained untouched, subtle disturbances in the arrangement of certain items. The way he spoke, it was as if he feared his work was being, monitored. The conversation was interrupted by Greta, who appeared in the doorway with the nervous energy of someone bearing unwelcome news. Her usually rosy cheeks were pale, and she twisted her apron in her hands with unconscious anxiety. "Monsieur Poirot, forgive the interruption, but I have remembered something important about last evening." "Oui, ma petite. Every detail, however small, may prove significant." "When I served the second coffee to Dr. Finch at 10 o'clock, I noticed he was not alone in the library. There was someone with him, speaking in whispers near the French doors. I could not see clearly because of the shadows and the way they positioned themselves, but I heard raised voices. An argument, perhaps." Poirot leaned forward with the intensity of a jeweler examining a particularly complex stone. "You could distinguish any words from this conversation?" "Only fragments, sir. Something about reputation and consequences." Dr. Finch seemed quite upset, and the other person was trying to calm him, but their voice carried a note of desperation, I think, as if they were pleading with him about something very important. After thanking both servants, Poirot made his way to the library where Dr. Finch had spent his final hours. The afternoon light revealed details that shadow had previously concealed, and the detective's trained eye immediately noticed something that had escaped earlier observation. Moving to the fireplace, he knelt with characteristic precision and examined the ash bed with the thoroughness of an archaeologist. "Most interesting," he murmured, using a silver letter opener to carefully extract several charred fragments from the grate. The papers had been burned recently, their destruction clearly deliberate, rather than the casual disposal of unwanted documents. With infinite patience, he arranged the fragments on the library desk, his keen eyes deciphering the stubborn remnants that had survived the flames. The largest fragment revealed partial words that made his pulse quicken. "Star of Cand." And below it, in Dr. Finch's precise handwriting, "Doublet construction confirmed." Another piece showed insurance valuation and what appeared to be a drastically reduced monetary figure. The final fragment, brittle and treacherous, yielded the most damning evidence. "Loan security compromised. Recommend immediate." The implications crystallized in Poirot's mind with shocking clarity. Dr. Finch had discovered that the Star of Kandahar, the centerpiece of the Baroness's collection, was not the single magnificent stone it appeared to be, but rather a doublet, two thin layers of genuine stone and glass expertly fused to create the illusion of a much larger, more valuable gem. Such a discovery would have catastrophic implications for everyone whose financial security depended upon the collection's authenticated value. Returning to the Grand Salon, Poirot requested that Mrs. Pemberton bring him her handbag and the tin of throat lozenges she had described. She complied with her usual efficiency, though the brisk click of the clasp could not disguise the tension in the set of her mouth. He opened the tin under her watchful eye, taking in the neat compartments, the precisely folded inner papers, the waxy sheen of menthol on the silvered lid. "You see, madame," Poirot observed, examining the various wrappers. "These small papers, they tell stories. This one is carelessly crushed, this folded twice, and this one—" He held up a wrapper folded into a perfect square, each edge aligned with mathematical precision. "This speaks of habits ingrained through years of training, habits that value exactitude above all else." Mrs. Pemberton attempted a smile that failed to reach her eyes. "I simply try to keep things orderly, Monsieur Poirot, though I confess I do not attend to such trifles with military precision." Indeed not, madame. But someone among our company does. His gaze drifted meaningfully toward where Captain Hartwell stood near the window, the man's handkerchief tucked with exact corners, his posture reflecting decades of military discipline. There is a language to the hand's habits, Captain. It speaks when the lips remain silent. The psychological pressure was mounting like steam in a kettle, and Poirot could see its effects in the subtle changes of posture, the barely perceptible shifts in breathing patterns, the way certain guests avoided meeting his penetrating gaze. The burned documents had provided the crucial missing piece of the puzzle, motive on a scale that could drive someone to murder. Dr. Finch had not merely discovered an authentication error. He had uncovered a deception that would ruin careers, destroy fortunes, and shatter the carefully constructed edifice of reputation and trust upon which so many lives depended. As evening approached and the mountain shadows lengthened across the crystal walls, Poirot prepared for the next phase of his investigation. The truth had begun to crystallize in his mind, with the clarity of the chalet's magnificent architecture. But several crucial elements still required his methodical attention before the complete picture would emerge. The psychological game was now fully engaged, and soon, very soon, the mounting pressure would force the guilty party to make the fatal error that would expose their deadly secret. As the mountain dusk gathered outside the Crystal Chalet's magnificent windows, Poirot requested a private audience with the Baroness in her personal study. The smaller room, with its careful arrangement of family portraits and diplomatic memorabilia, seemed to shrink around Helena von Stauffen as she faced the Belgian detective across her mahogany desk. The burned fragments of Dr. Finch's final assessment lay between them like accusations written in ash. "The Star of Kandahar," Poirot began gently, his keen eyes studying her aristocratic features. "It holds particular significance beyond its monetary value, does it not?" The Baroness's steel-grey eyes met his without flinching, though her fingers tightened around the ornate letter opener she had been using to sort correspondence. "It was my late husband's pride, acquired during his diplomatic service in India, the centerpiece of everything we built together." Her voice carried the weight of accumulated years and carefully managed finances. "Without its authentication, the foundation of our life's work crumbles. And if Dr. Finch intended to publish a correction that would invalidate his previous certification, revealing the stone to be a doublet rather than a single magnificent gem." Poirot allowed the implication to settle between them like morning frost. The Baroness's composure cracked slightly, revealing the desperation beneath her aristocratic bearing. Alistair mentioned concerns about his earlier work, yes. He seemed tormented by the possibility that age had made him less discerning. But the implications— She gestured helplessly toward the portraits of her ancestors. The museum loans, the charitable foundations, the cultural programs, all dependent upon that single authentication. Hundreds of people would suffer if his reputation for infallibility was shattered. After leaving the Baroness, Poirot encountered Julian Thorne pacing the corridor with barely contained agitation. The young financier's pocket watch had become a talisman of sorts, consulted with increasing frequency as if time itself might provide escape from the mounting pressure. "Your firm's exposure extends far beyond simple loan arrangements, does it not?" Poirot observed, noting how Thorne's hand trembled slightly as he returned the watch to his waistcoat. "We structured investment vehicles based on Dr. Finch's authentication," Thorne admitted, his face flushing with the telltale signs of a man caught between honesty and self-preservation. "Pension funds, insurance companies, private investors, if the Star of Kandahar were revealed as significantly less valuable than certified." He swallowed hard. "Complete ruin. Professional disgrace, criminal charges for misrepresentation. Everything I've worked to build would be destroyed in a single revelation." As evening shadows lengthened across the chalet's pristine floors, Poirot gathered the household in the Grand Salon. The guests arranged themselves with unconscious patterns that had emerged over the investigation, each seeking positions that offered both visibility and psychological comfort. The crystal display case caught the dying light, its contents seeming to pulse with internal fire, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his accented voice carrying quiet authority, "we have reached the point where truth must emerge from shadow. Dr. Finch died because he discovered something that threatened to destroy not merely one person, but an entire network of financial relationships built upon deception." He moved to the display case with deliberate precision. The burned documents in the library fireplace contained his corrected assessment. The Star of Kandahar is what gemologists call a doublet, two thin layers of genuine stone and glass, expertly fused to create the illusion of extraordinary value. Such a discovery would have catastrophic implications for everyone whose security depended upon the collection's authentication. A collective intake of breath swept through the assembled guests. Mrs. Pemberton's efficient composure wavered, Captain Hartwell's military bearing stiffened, and Madame Dubois pressed her gloved hand to her throat. Dr. Finch's professional integrity made him dangerous to our murderer. Poirot continued, his gaze moving from face to face with surgical precision. He could not be bought, could not be reasoned with, could not be persuaded to maintain a comfortable lie. Someone in this room knew that his corrected findings would destroy their carefully constructed world and chose murder over financial ruin. The psychological pressure in the room had reached a breaking point. Poirot could see it in the subtle changes of posture, the barely perceptible shifts in breathing patterns, the way certain guests avoided meeting his penetrating gaze. His little grey cells had arranged the evidence into its final configuration, and now the dramatic revelation that would expose the killer was within reach. "Tomorrow morning," he announced with quiet finality, "the authorities will arrive with experts to examine the collection. Before that occurs, I shall reveal not only the identity of Dr. Finch's murderer, but the ingenious method by which they transformed a simple throat remedy into an instrument of death. The truth, mes amis, like the crystal that surrounds us, may appear fragile, but it possesses the power to shatter even the most carefully constructed deceptions." The crystal chalet seemed to hold its breath as the moment of ultimate revelation approached, its glass walls reflecting not merely the dying light of day, but the fractured reflections of lives built upon lies and maintained through desperate measures. Night descended upon the crystal chalet with an oppressive stillness that seemed to amplify every small sound. The tick of the grandfather clock, the whisper of settling snow against the windows, the barely audible rustle of fabric as the assembled guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Poirot stood before them in the Grand Salon, his small figure commanding absolute attention despite the magnitude of the revelation that awaited. The Belgian detective moved with deliberate precision to the crystal display case, his keen eyes reflecting the lamplight as he surveyed the faces before him. Each guest sat frozen in their position, afraid that the smallest movement might draw his penetrating gaze and mark them as the killer who had walked among them with such deadly purpose. "The human mind," Poirot began, his accented voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "It seeks to impose order even in the most chaotic circumstances. This fundamental truth has guided my investigation from the moment I discovered this small piece of evidence." He produced the neatly folded tissue paper from his waistcoat pocket, holding it up to catch the lamplight. Most people, when disposing of a wrapper, crumple it carelessly, without thought, but observe these precise creases, each fold sharp and deliberate, executed with the exactitude of someone whose very soul demands mathematical precision. The tissue paper seemed to pulse with significance as Poirot continued his methodical explanation. Our murderer faced a seemingly impossible challenge: how to poison Dr. Finch with absolute certainty while surrounded by witnesses, leaving no trace of their involvement. The solution required intimate knowledge of human psychology, access to the necessary materials, and, most crucially, the ability to exploit the victim's own discomfort. Mrs. Pemberton's usually steady hands betrayed the slightest tremor as Poirot's gaze moved across the assembled guests. Captain Hartwell's military bearing seemed more pronounced than ever, as if discipline alone could shield him from the approaching revelation. Dr. Finch suffered from throat irritation throughout the evening, a discomfort exacerbated by the dry mountain air. Several guests sought relief from the communal lozenges in the powder room, but Dr. Finch required something more potent. Mrs. Pemberton, with characteristic kindness, offered him one of her superior remedies from her personal supply. Poirot paused, allowing the significance to settle. But the lozenge Dr. Finch ultimately consumed was not the one she so carefully wrapped and provided. The revelation sent a visible shock through the room. Miss Vance leaned forward with the fascination of a novelist recognizing a masterful plot twist, while Madame Dubois pressed her gloved hand more firmly against her throat. The substitution occurred during those final, chaotic minutes before midnight, when guests were moving about the salon, positioning themselves for the New Year's toast. In the confusion of champagne service and social pleasantries, our murderer approached Dr. Finch with military precision, executing a sleight of hand perfected through years of disciplined training. Poirot's eyes settled with laser intensity on Captain Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, whose weathered features had gone pale beneath his tan. Captain Hartwell, your observation skills served you well in describing Dr. Finch's final moments, perhaps too well for someone who claimed to be merely a casual observer. You noted with remarkable precision how he held his champagne glass, how he transferred it between hands, how he consumed something just before his collapse. Such detailed recollection suggests not the memory of a witness, but the careful attention of someone monitoring the success of their deadly plan. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft whisper of snow against the crystal walls. Captain Hartwell remained motionless, his military posture intact despite the mounting evidence. The throat lozenge you substituted contained cyanide, easily obtained from the household silver polish, a common source readily available in any well-maintained residence. Your years of military service provided both the chemical knowledge necessary to concentrate the poison and the steady hands required to create a convincing replica of Mrs. Pemberton's superior remedy. Poirot moved closer to the captain, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. But it was your ingrained habits that ultimately betrayed you, mon ami. The tissue paper in which you wrapped your deadly creation bears the unmistakable signature of military training, each fold precise, each crease sharp, executed with the same exactitude you applied to every aspect of your service career. Even in the commission of murder, you could not suppress the discipline that defined your very identity. Captain Hartwell finally stirred, his jaw tightening as he met Poirot's penetrating gaze. The weight of evidence, combined with the psychological pressure that had been building throughout the investigation, had reached its breaking point. Your motive was not merely financial desperation, though the collapse of your investment portfolio would indeed have been catastrophic, Poirot continued relentlessly. Dr. Finch's discovery that the Star of Kandahar was a doublet, a clever fusion of genuine stone and glass, threatened not only your material security, but something far more precious to a man of your background, your reputation, your honor, your standing in society. The whispered argument Greta overheard in the library was your final, desperate attempt to persuade Dr. Finch to remain silent. When he refused, you realized that only his permanent silence could preserve the carefully constructed edifice of trust and authentication upon which so many lives depended. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, its resonant tones seeming to mark the end of deception and the beginning of truth. Captain Hartwell slowly straightened to his full height, his military bearing intact despite the circumstances. "Your reasoning is impeccable, Monsieur Poirot," he said with the calm dignity of a soldier acknowledging defeat. "I will not insult your intelligence by attempting further deception. Dr. Finch was an honorable man, but his integrity would have destroyed not only my own future, but the financial security of countless others who trusted my recommendations. I convinced myself that one life was a reasonable price to pay for preventing such widespread ruin. The confession hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and terrible in its honesty. Mrs. Pemberton gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock and dismay. The other guests sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that the quiet, dependable military man who had moved among them with such deadly purpose was indeed the killer they had feared. Poirot nodded with the satisfaction of a craftsman whose work had achieved its intended purpose. The truth, mes amis, like the crystal that surrounds us, may appear fragile, but it possesses the power to shatter even the most carefully constructed deceptions. Captain Hartwell, your military training served you well in the execution of this crime, but it was those same ingrained habits of precision and order that ultimately led to your exposure. The Crystal Chalet, which had seemed a glittering sanctuary above the world, had indeed become a prison of glass and snow. But now, as dawn approached and the storm finally cleared, the bars were closing around the one person who truly deserved their constraint, while justice prepared to descend from the mountains with the same inexorable certainty as the morning light. The weight of Captain Hartwell's confession settled over the Crystal Chalet like the mountain mist, transforming the elegant salon into something resembling a courtroom where justice had finally been served. The assembled guests sat in stunned silence, each processing the revelation that the quiet, dependable military man who had moved among them with such deadly precision was indeed the killer they had feared. Mrs. Pemberton pressed her handkerchief to her lips, her usual efficiency shattered by the realization that her kindness had been exploited as an instrument of murder. To think that my throat lozenges, meant to bring comfort, became the vehicle for such horror, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the whisper of settling snow. You must not blame yourself, madame. Poirot replied gently, his keen eyes studying the captain's composed features. Evil often masquerades as kindness, using our better impulses as tools for darker purposes. Captain Hartwell exploited your compassion, just as he exploited Dr. Finch's professional integrity. Captain Hartwell stood with military bearing intact, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in the posture that had defined his entire adult life. I offer no excuses for my actions, Monsieur Poirot. Dr. Finch was an honorable man, but his integrity would have destroyed not only my own future, but the financial security of countless others who trusted my recommendations. I convinced myself that one life was a reasonable price to pay for preventing such widespread ruin. The grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, its resonant tones seeming to mark the end of deception and the beginning of truth. Dawn was breaking over the alpine peaks, painting the crystal walls with shades of gold and rose that transformed the chalet into a cathedral of light. As if summoned by the morning itself, the sound of heavy vehicles grinding up the mountain road announced the arrival of the authorities. Emile Keller moved swiftly to admit the Swiss police, their official presence bringing the weight of the outside world into the elegant sanctuary that had harbored such deadly secrets. Captain Hartwell offered no resistance as the handcuffs were applied, maintaining his dignity even in the moment of his ultimate defeat. I regret the necessity of my actions, he said quietly, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his fellow guests. But I do not regret the decision itself. The alternative was a ruin that would have engulfed too many innocent lives. As the police vehicle disappeared down the treacherous mountain road, carrying its prisoner toward justice, the remaining guests began the difficult process of coming to terms with the events that had shattered their New Year's celebration. The Baroness, her aristocratic composure intact despite the revelation about her collection, addressed the practical matters with characteristic directness. The authorities have confirmed your deductions about the Star of Kandahar, Monsieur Poirot, she announced, her steel-gray eyes reflecting both resignation and relief. It is indeed a doublet, though so expertly crafted, that even experienced gemologists were deceived for decades. The insurance companies are being notified, and arrangements made for proper restitution. Julian Thorne, his financial empire in ruins but his life intact, spoke with the hollow voice of a man who had glimpsed the abyss. I shall have to start again, build something honest this time. Perhaps there is wisdom to be found in complete failure, a clarity that success never provides. Madame Dubois examined her gloved hands with new understanding. In my profession, one learns to distinguish between authentic beauty and clever imitation. I failed to apply that same scrutiny to human character. Captain Hartwell appeared so trustworthy, so honorable in his bearing. Appearances, they can be most deceiving, Poirot observed, moving to stand before the crystal display case that had been the catalyst for such tragedy. Even false gems can create true beauty, but the price of deception is always higher than the value of truth. As the day progressed and the guests prepared for their departure, each processing the events in their own manner, Poirot found himself alone in the Grand Salon. The star of Kandahar sat in its velvet setting, still beautiful despite its revealed deception, still capable of capturing light and throwing it back in brilliant fragments. Miss Eleanor Vance approached with the measured step of someone who had witnessed material for her greatest novel. Monsieur Poirot, in your experience, what drives an honorable man to commit such a dishonorable act? Desperation, mademoiselle, combined with the dangerous belief that the ends can justify the means. Captain Hartwell's tragedy was not that he was inherently evil, but that he allowed fear of financial ruin to corrupt his better nature. The human condition, it is complex, filled with shadows and light in equal measure. Lady Beatrice, ever the actress, found drama even in departure. To think we shared champagne and conversation with a murderer, never suspecting the darkness that lurked beneath such respectable appearances. Au contraire, madame, Poirot replied with gentle firmness. It should reinforce our understanding that trust must be earned through consistent action, not assumed based on surface appearances. The most dangerous deceptions are always those we tell ourselves, the lies we embrace to justify our darker impulses. As afternoon settled over the crystal chalet, transforming the pristine snow into a canvas of gold and shadow, Poirot stood in contemplative silence. The little grey cells had completed their intensive labor, arranging the final pieces of this deadly puzzle into their shocking but inevitable conclusion. Emile Keller approached with the quiet respect of a man who had witnessed justice served. The roads are clear now, Monsieur Poirot. Your car is prepared whenever you wish to depart. Merci, mon ami. But first, I think, a moment of reflection. This chalet has seen much drama in these past days. Love and greed, honor and betrayal, life and death. It deserves a moment of peace before returning to its role as sanctuary. The Belgian detective adjusted his perfectly tied cravat with characteristic precision, his keen eyes making one final survey of the Grand Salon. The crystal chalet sparkled around him, its glass walls reflecting the afternoon sun in patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance with their own mysterious logic. The truth, he murmured to himself, like the crystal that surrounds us, may appear fragile, but it possesses the power to shatter even the most carefully constructed deceptions. Dr. Finch died for his integrity, Captain Hartwell fell through his lack of it, and justice, though delayed, has finally been served. Outside, the alpine peaks stood eternal and serene, indifferent to human passion and folly, offering their silent testimony that some things endured beyond the temporary storms of greed and desperation. As Hercule Poirot finally departed the magnificent sanctuary, leaving it to heal from its wounds, he carried with him the satisfaction of another mystery solved, another truth revealed, another demonstration that order could be restored from chaos through the patient application of logic and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The crystal chalet stood empty now, its secrets exposed and its shadows banished, waiting for new guests who might bring their own mysteries to its glittering halls. But for now, it rested in silence, beautiful and serene, a testament to the enduring power of truth to triumph over even the most carefully constructed deceptions. The little grey cells had once again proven their worth, and somewhere in the pristine mountain air, the ghost of Dr. Alistair Finch could finally rest in peace, knowing that his dedication to truth had not died with him, but had instead become the instrument of justice itself.